Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar on board leadership, supporting your board through the next phase of the pandemic. It's really great to have so many of you on the call with us today, and we're delighted to be hosting this webinar in partnership with the Association of Chairs. So my name is Josie Hinton and I'm Capacity Building Programmes Manager here at NCVO. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Dan Francis, our lead governance consultant here at NCVO, and also by Ros Oakley, Chief Executive of the Association of Chairs. So recent government announcements regarding the easing of lockdown, as we all know, poses new and important challenges and opportunities for boards of trustees. Whilst the look and feel of these challenges and opportunities will inevitably vary depending on an organisation's size and context, all boards will need to be clear about their role in this next phase and what this new context means for their organisation. So with this in mind, today we're going to be covering the following. Just wait for Dan to move on to the next slide. Okay, so Ros is going to kick us off by taking us through the role of the chair and the board in supporting organisations in the next phase. Dan is then going to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that the easing of lockdown presents for trustees. And throughout this webinar, we will be signposting you to resources to help you plan in what we know is a period of significant change. We will have about 15 minutes at the end to take any questions. And just a final reminder before I pass over to Ros that we are going to be recording this webinar. You will be able to access the recording on NCVO Know-How in our coronavirus section. And you should have already received the slides before the webinar, but we'll also be putting them up on our NCVO Know-How site. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ros.
Thank you, Josie, and welcome everybody to the webinar. Really pleased to be talking to you today about the role of the chair and the board. In the next few minutes, what I'm going to be focusing on is the role of the board as we move into the next phase. Of course, what you need to do next depends on your situation and what phase you're actually in. So those of us who are still delivering services, particularly if it's in a different way or at a much higher level, have probably been operating at full tilt over the last few weeks with little time to stop and think beyond the short term. Many of us, or many of you, will have short-term financial difficulties, in which case you've got an added level of pressure on top of that, and indeed your finances may actually have prevented you from operating. For those of you who've reduced or stopped your services either partly or wholly, you're more likely to have had time to think, but you may have key staff furloughed, shielded, ill, or even worse, and you're faced with a large amount of uncertainty. And then virtually all of us, regardless of our short-term financial position, are concerned about our mid and longer term finances. So these different situations will put you in very different places. And of course, they'll be overlaid by the differing personal circumstances of trustees and staff and volunteers. So I'd like to ask you a question, run a poll now, to get a sense of which of these situations you're in. So I'm just launching the poll. So what best describes your situation at the moment? Have a think. So looking at these two issues, whether you're in short-term financial distress or actually whether your short-term finances are okay, and whether you're stopping or reducing services or continuing or expanding them, or perhaps none of these things apply to you. So just giving you all a chance to think about which of these best applies to your situation. And then in a few minutes, we'll just, in a minute or two, we'll see what the results are. So we have a sense of what the different circumstances are for each of you. So great, thanks very much everybody for filling that in. So we can see for most of you, your short-term finances are okay, but you've reduced or stopped your services, but significant numbers in those other contexts. So that's really helpful to know. And I think it really illustrates the point that We're not actually all in the same boat, but we are in the same storm. And this isn't my quote, I couldn't source where it's come from, but for me, this is a really relevant quote to our current situation, because some of our organisations may be small or large. You might have lots of crew or very few. You might have basic equipment or advanced equipment. So that is going to affect how you respond. And in a storm, we need to seek and offer help to each other. So just as our boats are different, what we're noticing is that different boards are in different places at the moment, taking on different roles. So in some cases, people are pretty much bailing. They're trying to get the water out of the boat to stay afloat and to avoid being overwhelmed, or even considering whether they need to take to the lifeboats. And it's a case of all hands on deck. For others, it's more about they've moved into a rowing position if they're in a small boat, or perhaps they're in the engine room. And what they're trying to do there as board members is add extra capacity or extra capability. And that's particularly in small organisations, but not exclusively. Others are in the map room. They've realised they've been hit by this storm, they've been blown off course, and they're busy looking at what their options are. Where else can they go? Because perhaps the original destination is no longer possible. Others have sent some brave soul up into the eagle's nest or the lookout point, and they're trying to look ahead about what the options are, what lies ahead. In some cases, board members are at the helm, and that could be for a variety of reasons. It might be because you don't have a CEO, you don't have staff anyway, or perhaps your CEO is furloughed or sick, or as a board, you're feeling the need to be more actively involved. Now, that may or may not be appropriate. It may be that actually the board is overstretching itself and is usurping your chief exec, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. The important thing, of course, is that there is somebody at the helm. You're not all so busy bailing, because otherwise you might hit the rocks. Others are already moving into adjusting course, and that's probably more likely if you're not currently delivering services. You've probably had more space to think about what do we now need to do, what do we need to do differently, and perhaps you've already or are moving on to setting new direction for where you need to go. Of course, the natural domain of the board really is those last two. It's about setting course, adjusting course, agreeing new direction. And whilst in an emergency, you may need to be in those other modes, at some point, it's really important that the board finds the capacity to move into its natural domain of setting direction. It's also where they can add most value, because a lot of executive teams at the moment are really stretched and just don't have the space to think about the longer term. So I'm going to launch another poll now, just to ask and get a sense of which best describes your current focus as a board. Are you in kind of bailing mode, rowing, at the helm, getting your bearings, or setting a new direction at the moment? Hopefully one of those comes close to expressing where you are. So when we're ready, we will get the results on that to get a sense of the different situations that we're in. So I think just giving you a few more minutes. Okay, interesting. So interesting split. And that's useful as we go through the rest of this to understand the different places that you're in. So step one, I think really at this stage, is understanding where your board is focusing, because at some point you do need to move on to those other stages. But at Association of Chairs, what we're noticing in our conversations with chairs and others is that coronavirus is, of course, having impacts on boards and board behaviours. And that is also worth thinking about. So in the next slide, I'm just going to share with you what we're noticing that may be helpful for you as chairs and other board members to think about the dynamics of what's going on within your board. The first one is really, and it may seem obvious, but it's worth really thinking about the way in which your board members and key staff have been personally affected. So that might be their own health, it may be their well-being, their personal or their financial circumstances. And it is affecting different people in different ways. And of course, that takes an emotional toll on people. So you may find that energy and emotion of the different key members of your team is elsewhere or is different to what you're used to. Perhaps you'll find your most active board member is no longer able to be active. And you may also find that large amount of anxiety that people are experiencing is driving changes in behaviour, and they're doing things you're not used to. So that's quite useful to reflect on that as you think about bringing your board together as a team for the next phase. The next thing really is around some boards feel somewhat disorientated and have lost focus. Maybe that you had a really clear plan, perhaps you've just signed off on a strategy, but there's so much going on and the scope and pace of change is making it difficult to focus. The next issue really is the need for faster decision making. So you're probably finding that your executive team need you to make decisions faster. So that's perhaps affecting how frequently you need to meet or whether you're having to delegate decisions to a subgroup. And there might be levels of discomfort around that, particularly if there's limited information. And that takes us on to our next point, which is around different needs for information. So your standard board reports probably aren't fit for purpose anymore. You'll feel a need for more information. Now, some of that might be more than you really need. And I think a key role of the chair at the moment is to make sure the board isn't asking for too much. But it's understandable that you will need different information. Some of it necessary, some of it more about just trying to assuage your anxiety. Also, and this is always there, board members have different attitudes to risk, but this is going to come to the fore even more. So particularly if there are concerns around personal liability or if you're potentially facing insolvency, and you may be aware that some of your existing controls, you're not sure how well they're working for the charity. So again, it's helpful to be aware of that because they can give rise to different types of tension in the board, because you kind of need to understand where people are coming from in order to make sure that your conversations take you forward productively. Another thing that we are noticing, of course, is the emergence of new priorities. So things that felt important before may not be. And obviously, these are going to be different for each of you. For some of you, it might be a heightened focus on staff well-being, particularly if they're still out there delivering and you're concerned about keeping them safe. It might be about business continuity planning, including loss of key people. Perhaps you're doing much more online and have concerns around cybersecurity. And indeed, simply raising money may have taken on a different priority for you. Another is a change in board engagement. So this kind of picks up on the earlier points, but you may well find that your staff your board is either now much more involved, possibly over-involved, but for some, they may have disengaged. And I've certainly heard that for some chief executives and chairs, they're finding some trustees just are not as engaged as they would hope. And you will see that there may well have been a loss of boundaries between the staff team and the board. Which takes us on to the next point, excuse me, which is about potentially changing relationships with your staff, especially the chief executive. Again, we're seeing that many chairs and chief executives and boards are working together really well. They've really risen to the occasion and they're finding ways to work well together. They're communicating regularly, but not over communicating. But in some cases, the current situation is exacerbating difficulties that were already there or exposing issues with the relationship that hadn't really been apparent before. So that's another key one to be aware of. The next one is really about changes in board dynamics. I'm thinking here within the board, so particularly if you have had a group who are really engaged in making quick decisions, there may be a sense of people feeling left out, possibly an inner cabal. And also there may be changing dynamics with your staff team, including if you have people on furlough who might feel disconnected. And on the other hand, you might get resentment from staff who have still been working. So all of these different factors may mean that your board, which you might have been feeling was humming along wonderfully, very productively, actually needs more attention from you as chair to enable it to function well so that it can give good direction and maintain momentum. So those are the kind of the factors to think about: where you are, what mode the board is in, what's going on within your board, particularly in terms of behaviours and attitudes. So what can we do about it? So moving on to things that can help you. The first one is really about showing emotional intelligence. So that is about investing time in understanding what's going on for your board members individually and collectively, and for key staff members, and thinking about how you offer support to each other. And that might be simple things about, before a board meeting, making time to connect with each other. It may be in arranging an informal coffee time to catch up with people. Understanding where people are coming from is really helpful in understanding their behaviour, because anxiety can manifest in many ways, and it can become quite destructive. Displaced emotion, anxiety can result in people making unreasonable demands on board members or on the chief executive. It might lead them to denying things or making disproportionate demands. And understanding what's going on and giving a chance to express that can help reduce those issues. Another issue is about people being tired. I mean, some of you might well have come through the first part really well, but are now finding that the fatigue is setting in. And that probably includes you as chairs, if you've been heavily involved. So do take care of yourselves and give each other permission to do that. It's likely that you actually need to expect new norms of behaviour and encourage some new norms of behaviour. Personal and work life have never been more intertwined, and it's worth acknowledging that and giving each other a bit of more forgiveness and tolerance around mistakes. We're all moving at pace and mistakes are inevitable at the moment. The next thing we can do is help the board adjust mode. So if you have been bailing and are heavily involved, a key thing for the chair is to think, well, when can we step back, or can I recruit a small group who can do that piece of work if we still need people very much on the front line? The next key thing is to remember this is all about those we serve. It's purpose first. And I know many of us concerned about the survival of our organisations, but the most important thing is actually what is the best way to serve your beneficiaries. And if you need to close or merge, there is no shame in that, but the aim is to close well. The question is, are there better ways to meet the needs of our beneficiaries right now? And are you hearing from them? And that includes a conversation around your board table about how to balance the needs of current and future beneficiaries. The next key thing really is to be strategic, to make sure that ideally the whole board, if not maybe a subset at this stage, are stepping back and bringing a different perspective, especially a longer term one. It's a key thing that you can contribute at the moment, and there are a range of strategic tools that you can use to do that, such as visioning and scenario planning. And Dan will talk about the couple of approaches that may be useful to you shortly. The other thing I would urge, which builds on the earlier point, is to look for paradigm shifts. This is such a major change that's affecting the whole of our society at the moment, that you may find that really big shifts go on. It might be shifts by your beneficiaries about what their needs now are. It might be how you use volunteers, who those volunteers are, how you deliver your services, or how you approach your fundraising. So it's quite possible you need to make some really bold changes. So be open to bold changes in thinking. The next tip I would offer is the importance of actually making decisions. It's very easy with so much information to feel overwhelmed and to be paralysed, but we do need to make decisions. We may get them wrong, so let's be ready for course adjustments. But where those decisions need to be made, it's the role of the board to face the difficult decisions and make them, and the role of the chair to make sure that you are drawing out the really important decisions that your board needs to face and make. The other thing I would urge, picking up on the earlier points I made, is the importance of giving your chief executive and team both space and support. And there is no single formula for that. Some chief executives are finding it great to speak to their chairs and a handful of trustees regularly. Others need less contact. That's something that you need to talk about together. I certainly know that some chairs are finding that they've prioritised the discussion with chief executives, and issues and concerns coming from the trustees come via them. But there are different patterns of communication. Important to agree those. The final point is really that you still need to attend to the good governance essentials. So the things that we always talk about around good governance are still there, and in fact they're coming to the fore at the moment. So your opportunity and risk assessment, you will be needing to refresh it. No doubt it's got new sections. I know at AOC we've written an entire new risk and opportunity register specifically around COVID-19. You'll want financial information like cash flow, and you may be using mechanisms like time-limited board working groups, but be clear about what decision-making flexibility they have. So those are the main points I wanted to make. I'm just going to share with you some of the resources that Association of Chairs can offer. We've got a number of coronavirus-related resources, and we have events coming up around personal resilience, both for chairs and those that they're working with. The chairs, more discussion around the chair's role post-pandemic, legal sessions on the issues involved with return to work, staff restructuring and redundancies if you're finding you're in that situation. And we also have lots of written resources, including our existing series on working with trustees, which look at some of these issues around board dynamics and board behaviours. These are open, many of these resources are open to everyone, some only to our members or to those who are enrolled in our Beacon programme, which is a free programme for charities under $1 million. I'm pleased to say we've just had funding to extend that till the end of September, so more of our resources are available to you. NCVO also has lots of useful resources, and particularly strategic planning tools, and they'll be emailing those after the webinar. So now I'd like to hand over to Dan. Thank you.
That was a really helpful walk through some of the things that I think lots of boards are thinking about at the moment and how to respond. I've been tasked with leading this next section on the challenges and opportunities which boards face. And as we were kind of thinking about how best to approach this, one of the first things that dawned on us is that actually the challenges and opportunities are really quite different depending on who you are, what your context is, and how the pandemic and its implications are playing out for your funding and your beneficiaries. And so it's with that in mind that we actually took a slightly different tack. And I've tried to present you with some options for how to assess your environment. After today's webinar, we will be sending a follow-up email with a link to lots of resources that help you identify what those challenges are and which talk about those challenges in more depth. But here it's about kind of assessing your environment. So as we all know, there's so much change at the moment. And this was a quote from Forbes magazine from March 2020. Which says that employee directives to work from home, travel bans, conferences postponed, cancelled or taken virtually, self-quarantine, social distancing, and stockpiling of supplies. If ever the phrase VUCA felt appropriate to use, it's now. And I have to be honest, reading this article was the first time I had come across that VUCA phrase, but certainly it seemed to fit with, it seemed to be occurring in lots of articles I was reading on managing change at the time and responding to the pandemic. And so it kind of piqued my interest. I think we can all kind of sympathize with that sense that the world around us has changed radically over the last 3 months, and that's had implications for every area of work. So it's making sense of that change and looking for any models that would help us make sense of it, which drew me to trying to understand a little bit more about what this meant. So how can we define VUCA as a term, as it was set out in that Forbes article? Well, it actually originates from military planning, but in the 80s and 90s was adapted for management methodology as a way of assessing your environment, understanding change, and understanding the leadership which is required to respond. And it is an acronym which stands for volatile, so events that happen outside of your control, uncertain, unclear or unpredictable future, complex, a dynamic environment, interconnected parts that may well be confusing or indeed present you with conflicting information, but also ambiguous, a lack of certainty in terms of the causality of what you might do and how that might affect the outcome of particular work. It's intended to reflect the forces of change that affect organisations, and as I've said, doing an assessment of your VUCA environment is a way of assessing kind of the leadership skills and approaches that are required to respond to different scenarios. However, as I was digging a little deeper and trying to understand this in more depth, I came across the article by Bennett and Lamoni in 2014 in the Harvard Business Review, which actually kind of turned this on its head a little bit and said that the VUCA as a term, as an acronym, has just become a cute, trendy way of saying unpredictable change. That essentially we are just using this term to lump in all different potential change. And as a result, the original purpose of its model has become redundant. And they said this for a number of reasons. But what Bennett and Lamoni encourage you to do is to undertake a proper assessment against each of these terms to assess whether or not for your organisation you are facing volatility, uncertainty, ambiguity or complexity. And they map it out on this kind of grid, this 2x4, which I think is a really helpful and actually quite simple tool for assessing how change in the external environment is likely to impact on your organisation. If you look at the axes, on the Y you have how well you can predict the result of your actions. And as you move up the 2x4, you have a better, where you have a better sense of being able to predict what the outcome of taking action might be. And on the bottom axes, you have how much do you know about a particular situation? So how much information is available to you, I suppose. As you move to the right-hand side there, you have greater knowledge, greater understanding of the challenge that is presented to you. Now, COVID-19 and the pandemic has certainly got some elements of all of this, of all of these areas, but it will present differently depending on the nature of your services, the nature of your funding and your environment. And that's why I think undertaking a context-specific assessment with your board could be really, really helpful in deciding your approach. So let me just explore these in a little more depth. And we'll start with volatility. So this is defined as an unexpected or unstable environment. challenge possibility for unknown duration. We don't know how long this is going to go on for. And but it's not always difficult or complicated to understand. So you may have lots of information about the current environment. You might know what impact this will have on your services, for example, or how your funders are responding. But nevertheless, you still don't know how long the current period is going to extend, and how that will impact on your services. The approach that Bennett and Lamoni suggest is that in this environment, in a volatile environment, you would build capacity to be more flexible. So that might involve perhaps recruiting people with kind of skills that are more flexible, either on your board, or upskilling existing staff to allow for some flexibility, perhaps in the way that you deliver services, or indeed devoting more resources to preparedness, which may involve putting more money into longer term funding plans or reserves in a volatile environment. It's often an expensive set of solutions to volatility, but it essentially allows you to build slack to weather a particular storm. Uncertainty is defined as the basic cause and effect are known. You will know what's caused the issue and what impact your actions will have on it. Change is possible, but the change may not be certain. So you may not have the result that you want from your activity. But you typically know quite a lot about the situation. You just can't really predict what impact your actions will have on the change. In this environment, Bennett and Lamoni encourage you to invest in information. So basically source as much possible intel as you can about what the implications of actions will be in order to build that understanding. Next, complexity. So this is where you're entering into a complex environment where there's lots of information, interconnected and dependent parts. And I'll give some examples of these a little later, but this is something which I think lots of organizations who perhaps are changing the way that their business model operates, who are seeking perhaps funding from new sources, are faced with a new and kind of complex world where we don't necessarily understand what the implications of our actions will be. And we also don't, where we may understand quite clearly what the implications of our actions might be, but we don't necessarily know an awful lot about the situation because it's so complex. The response here is often to restructure or to bring in specialists to build up kind of resource and capacity within our organization. So that might involve bringing in a new trustee who has a specialism in a particular area or has expertise. Or it might mean, if you're a larger organization with a staff team, restructuring or upskilling your staff to reflect your new environment. And then finally, ambiguity. This is where causal relationships are unclear. Very little precedence exists. In the words of Donald Rumsfeld, there are unknown unknowns. And so it becomes a very difficult situation to operate in, and the response is often iterative. It's about experimentation to build understanding of that cause and effect, to nudge you up towards the top. So you understand more about your environment, you understand what works through testing, essentially. And so hopefully what that has illustrated is that by properly analysing how COVID-19 is affecting your organisation, you are able to establish whether or not you are operating in a volatile, uncertain, in a complex or an ambiguous environment. And as a result, that will in turn help inform how you choose to respond. This is simply a model to help you decide how to move forward and inform your planning. So what does it mean for you? Well, Bennett and Lamoni say that actually, if we're going to capitalize on opportunities that change presents, then we really need to understand what that change means in the context of our organization. So that's the first thing. It's important to systematically undertake a real kind of assessment of what change means. Secondly, each of those terms under that acronym VUCA mean different things, as I've just talked through. And as a result, they require different leadership responses and approaches. And so if you're going to do that assessment, be prepared to respond differently depending on where you conclude the challenge and change is coming from. And third, their key point was that simply saying we live in a VUCA world, as Forbes magazine did in March, and I think as we've all said over the last couple of months, gosh, things are moving so quickly, how can we possibly plan in this environment, leads to an absence of planning, which is obviously unhelpful for organizations. So volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity all require their own separate responses, and it's really important to understand which of those is affecting our organization. My next two slides, I realize that this has the potential to be kind of confusing, even though it's kind of actually quite a simple model. And so what I wanted to do was kind of bring it alive for our own sector. And I've just written out two quite simple scenarios here. Obviously, you'll get the slides, or you've already got the slides, and so you've got the opportunity to kind of read these and digest it at your own leisure. But I think one of the other things that is obviously clear about any kind of change is that it's not always simple. And indeed, Bennett and Lamoni do say that you can get multiple factors which affect your change. And they do often present in combination. So I've done a bit of an assessment of two scenarios, which I think are probably not uncommon at the moment. The first is an advice service charity which can no longer offer face-to-face support due to social distancing. So in an assessment of this scenario, you would say it probably is quite volatile. This is happening quickly, meaning that users are not getting advice and they may end up in a position of crisis, and it's also very unclear how long it will go on for. But it's also ambiguous. There's no evidence to suggest that alternative services may be taken up, given perhaps the position that users are in to access them. And it's also unclear how long it will last and how long before the office can reopen. So if you were to use this model to decide how to respond, you would build Slack and plan for preparedness. So that would mean reviewing your reserves policies to protect sustainable income sources, speak with funders perhaps about the longer term and different approaches to funding, and consider investing in skills and tools you need within your volunteers or workforce to deliver differently in the longer term. But you would also consider perhaps experimenting, because you need to trial some things and not be paralyzed with the kind of lack of predictability and lack of information. So you also need to trial some different approaches to delivering advice in different ways via safe and social distancing means, of course. So that's my first example as to how this comes to life. And my second is that of a national charity that runs major events to generate income, which wants to seek to change its business model to a grant funding to cover core costs and charge less for remote events. Obviously not an uncommon scenario at the moment. But if you were to undertake a VUCA assessment, you might say that this is complex because grant funding world is very, very different to the charity's current operating model. It involves interconnected relationships with funders. The charity doesn't have those expertise. All funders have different priorities, different funding bids need to be tailored. The organization essentially needs to pivot. It needs to reflect the complexity of the environment in its own setup, whether that's through skills on its board, in its volunteers, or in its staff. Uncertainty is also an issue here. So we've got the charity is clear that if they receive grant funding, they will be more sustainable. So there is cause and effect. They are not yet clear on whether their work, though, is fundable, or even whether funders would be interested. So the kind of responses that dictates or suggests would be that you'd restructure or invest in specialists that mean that you can review your current structure and reflect the funding environment, but also you'd research and undertake projects to really get more information and understand the environment that they're operating in, establish networks and relationships. So hopefully those two scenarios give you some illustration of how this tool can be used quite practically in assessing both how the challenge is playing out for your organization and how the change is playing out, but also, importantly, how, from a leadership perspective, you respond. So I appreciate I've only just given you a couple of minutes to think about this, but I'd like to run a quick poll, which is, and you can see on the right-hand side there, the 2x4, and I would like you to think about which of these areas perhaps best describes the context and environment for your charity and its services now. I'll just give you a couple of minutes to think about whether or not you consider it to be volatility, uncertainty, complexity, or ambiguity. And I should say that I have just explained how it often presents in more than one of these ways, but I'm going to force you to pick one option, I'm afraid. Okay, we'll give people a couple more seconds just to complete that. Okay, we can close the poll. Okay, we're just waiting on those results. Okay, and the results are in. So we've got 46% of people would define this as an uncertain environment. 32% say it's complex, which is interesting in that it is presenting very, very differently there for different organizations. One where there is predictability of actions, and one where you know quite a lot about the situation, but there's perhaps less predictability about the outcome. Volatility is 16% and ambiguity 15%. For me, this really does illustrate how the same environment, the same storm, as Ros said, plays out very differently for why this exercise is worthwhile. Okay, so just some tips quickly in terms of using VUCA in board planning. I've presented 5 steps here. I think the first thing would be to brainstorm the changes and challenges which your organisation is faced with as a result of the pandemic. Try and diagnose the situation and set aside some time in a board meeting to have a discussion about whether or not those challenges present as volatility, uncertainty, ambiguity, or complexity, or some combination of those. Consider what kind of leadership and governance responses are required as a result of that. You can use this model. But I would say that obviously this is something which has typically been designed for the corporate sector. And so it's really important, I think, in ours to overlay your values and your objectives to tailor your response appropriately. If you're reading some of the literature on this stuff, you may say that one of the responses would be to aggressively go after a competitor or something. But obviously, I think, as Ros illustrated, that probably doesn't align with the values and objectives in our sector. Consider the value in scenario planning, and it's that which I'll just pick up. Once you've assessed your environment, I think it is worth thinking about various different outcomes and courses of action that can help you to deal with that volatility, uncertainty, complexity, or ambiguity. I would like to just take the opportunity to take one more poll, which is, have you undertaken any scenario planning on multiple potential options for decision making as a result of coronavirus? So if you could just complete that now. Okay, we will go ahead and close that poll. Okay, just waiting for the results. Okay, so it looks like we're split roughly down the middle, that some organisations say yes and others and 52% have not done that. It's great to see so many people are already at this stage. I completely understand why up until now that might not have been on the board's agenda. But I really would encourage you to both assess that change environment using perhaps the VUCA tool, but also to undertake some scenario planning. We have recently redeveloped our guidance on scenario planning on our know-how website, and you can visit that link that's embedded in the slides here to see that guidance. Obviously, it goes without saying that it's impossible to be certain about mapping various scenarios, but it really can help you to plan for different outcomes. And I would encourage you to start thinking in these terms, even if they're only relatively short-term scenario planning. We suggest 3 kind of key steps, which is mapping your environment that might involve the VUCA analysis, identifying a limited number of potential scenarios that you want to plan out and think about your actions and the actions of others in those scenarios, and then to develop plans and work backwards in a way which allows you to kind of identify indicators which would suggest that that scenario is playing out as you'd hope or not, and keep that under continual review.
Dan, sorry to interrupt. I think your slides have gone. I'm just conscious that people might not be able to see the presentation.
Oh. Can you see it now?
There we go, it's back. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Josie. I'm not sure why that was the case. You can see there under basically my final point was that we've also listed on that web page a number of kind of important considerations when scenario planning. So it's worth checking that guidance out and making sure that you use evidence, that you take account of kind of the complexity, who to involve, the human element, and also potential risks to your organisation when doing that. I'm not going to say a huge amount more on that because we did cover it in the last webinar, and there is this guidance online, but I wanted to flag it as a resource available to you. Okay, I'm going to hand back to you now, Josie, anyway, because we're going to open up to questions.
Great, thanks, Dan. So just to now start on a few questions that we've had in. So I think the first one, which I think is a really interesting one, which is whether both Dan, yourself and Ros can give people any tips on when you're having meetings and you can't read people's body language. Are there any tips that you have on how else you can kind of gauge a sense of how people are what people are feeling?
Yeah,
Dan,
Josie.
Go for it, Ros.
Okay, thanks very much. This is a great question, and I think lots of people are grappling with this. We have an online blog on the AOC website specifically about going beyond the basics with online board meetings. So have a look at that. It's certainly got some suggestions, and we also have a webinar coming up on it on the 9th of July, which has actually been led by the chair of Relate, who does online facilitation for his day job. But some of the things I would draw out are things like you can use things like emojis. It's quite a brave move, and some board cultures that might be a bit of a shock. but you can either use ones that are built into the platform, so you can turn those on, or you can create your own. So, you know, some boards have got hand gestures for saying, you know, yep, we agree. And I'm making assumption here that you're able to see each other. That's not possible on all platforms, but if you are able to set up your webinar so that you've got gallery mode, that really helps. Other things that you can do are use the breakout rooms. So for example, before the board meeting, because you don't have that usual kind of chit chat that you get when people are coming into the room, you can put different board members together in 2s or 3s just to have a chat in the different breakout rooms and then bring them back in. If your technology doesn't allow you to do that, you could consider getting them to call each other or use a WhatsApp group so that they can do that at the same time. Other possibilities are things like online whiteboards or round robins, where you quickly get a sense of where the board is coming from. As I say, there are more resources. I'd also definitely recommend Beth Cantor, who's done a lot of online facilitation and has got some great resources on this as well.
Great, Dan, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's really helpful. And for me, I think it is anything that helps you to overcome the sort of staid and formal nature of it. We say this all the time anyway with boards, the importance of designing and creating space for informality. You obviously need to be a lot more intentional about that when you're remote. And so anything that allows you to share how you're feeling, you know, talk informally. I love all of Roz's suggestions. So, but it definitely needs thought, and I think chairs, all trustees actually probably have a responsibility to take that on board. Great,
thanks, Dan. Just to also say, we did actually run a webinar slightly earlier in the lockdown phase, which covered some stuff around kind of how to manage online meetings, and you can find that on our NCVO coronavirus section of our know-how site. Okay, so moving on, and I think the next, it was actually a comment, but I think it's a really important point to raise. Someone put as a comment that partnering is the solution to survival, which I really like as a comment. And I just wondered if either of you had any reflections on the importance of partnership and collaboration at this time. Ros, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, the moment I saw that comment, I thought, yes, absolutely. And I should have made more of that in my presentation. I think partnership is really critical at the moment, and we're already seeing new partnerships emerge. And I absolutely think that is part of our solution. So thank you for the idea. I will update my slides and presentations. I think it's really important.
I'd agree. I think it's one of the things which you should absolutely be considering through your scenario planning, and I think our guidance encourages you to do that. It comes back to Roz's point at the very beginning of the presentation around, you know, purpose has to come first, beneficiary first, and I think we should be scanning the horizon as trustees to think, how can we do this? You know, how can we continue to offer these services, or how can we offer these services better if we were to do it in collaboration? Now is not the time for kind of organizational preservation for preservation's sake. You know, everyone is looking, should be looking at this.
Thanks, Dan. So got quite a few questions coming in now, so I'm going to try, we probably won't be able to answer them all, I'm afraid, because we've only got 5 minutes left. So I'm going to probably ask one more to Dan and one more to Ros. So I think the one for Dan is, if you can, a couple of people have sort of talked about what role trustees and the executive play in scenario planning. So whether you just want to talk about, you know, who should be involved in scenario planning and what roles they might play.
Yeah, this is some guidance which we do cover a little bit on the written guidance, and so I would encourage you to take a look at that. I think it does depend a little bit on the situation. I mean, obviously, if you were designing a new strategy and wanting to involve lots and lots of people, you'd probably draw your stakeholders in, your senior staff, your possibly volunteers and employees if you have them. The reality is, you know, we're talking here about scenario planning in a crisis as a result of change, and so I think once perhaps a small group of the board and possibly senior managers, if you have them, have assessed kind of the implications of change on your organisation, I think it's worth speaking to those to those immediate stakeholders that you have in terms of designing your scenarios, or at least testing your scenarios. But I also think that there is a limit to how much testing you can do right now, and actually you need to make decisions. So it's not a perfect answer, but I would say try to design something which allows you to get the information you need, but which probably isn't as much of a consultative exercise as you would normally do. Take a look at our scenario planning guidance for this, because it's one of the key considerations.
Great, thanks, Dan. And Ros, just I think a final one for you about what would you suggest if the chair isn't doing their job effectively, and maybe you can also signpost people to how they can join up with the Association of Chairs.
Thank you, Josie. That's an easy one to tackle in the closing minutes. Obviously, that's a real concern if the chair isn't doing their job effectively. I'm not sure what, I assume that's probably coming from a trustee. I think the main things to think about is obviously that you as a board are collectively responsible. So it's a question of figuring out why the chair isn't performing well. Might be a long-standing issue that really needed to be tackled earlier. It usually helps if a trusted member of the board is able to talk to the chair, have a one-to-one, or maybe a couple of them. It really helps if you've already got a vice chair in place, because often they are the conduit of messages like that to the chair when the rest of the board maybe feel the chair isn't doing the right thing. I think things you can practically do in the current situation, because it generally takes a while to move a chair on, although it is possible. I mean, if it's a case where the chair is usually effective but they're not doing the job well, it might be that they've got too much going on. So a timely conversation about asking whether somebody else can help, or maybe a more forceful conversation saying, look, there's a feeling in the board that we need to be more actively engaged, so that maybe the responsibilities that the chair isn't taking on are then shared amongst a group of key people on the board who can move that forward. So I think it's partly about understanding why they're not doing their job effectively, then identifying alternatives. And I think in the current situation, that's probably about stepping forward and volunteering to help. Worst resort is that you need to have a conversation with them about thinking about moving on. But you need to look at the likelihood of success and whether that's going to make things worse at that point. And in terms of how to join AOC, thank you for asking that question. Just head on over to our website at associationofchairs.org.uk, and the sign-up process is online. We'd love to have you as members.
Great, thanks, Ros. I'm aware we only have 1 minute left, and I know we haven't managed to answer all your questions. We will be sending out a follow-up email, as we usually do, with kind of links to useful resources. So hopefully those resources and guidance and upcoming events will help answer some of your questions. And as Ros mentions, do have a look at the AOC website and do become a member there. Just to flag up a few upcoming NCVO webinars. We are doing a webinar during Small Charities Week about building organisational resilience. So do have a look at that. We've actually also got one coming up next week, which I thought would be worth flagging, bearing in mind how many of you are kind of getting your bearings in the current situation. And that webinar is on making decisions in tough times. So hopefully there'll be some really helpful resources there for you in terms of making decisions about services, programmes and resourcing going forward. That's all we have time for today. It is midday. So as I say, thank you all very much for joining, and we do hope to see you again soon. Thanks a lot.